Hi there, Dave here. Welcome to Liquid Antiquarians Movies, shot as ever by the wonderful Sir Arthur Motley. This time it's a story that I've wanted to explore for some considerable time, which is examining the forgotten story of one of whisky's powerhouses. That's the city of Glasgow. It's a funny thing that we don't necessarily think of Glasgow as being a significant player in Scotch whisky's early history, and indeed in its history all the way right up into the 20th century, but it's true. So it figured that why don't we take a little bit of time and have a stravaig or a wander around some of the great sites within Glasgow that have somehow been excised from the history. This industrial powerhouse of whisky making, of blending, of industrialisation, of distribution, of the industry of whisky coming together, somehow has just been wiped from history. It's not saying that whisky is not being made in Glasgow or firms aren't still based there, but somehow its role within the birth of what we know as the Scotch whisky industry has been forgotten. So, who better to take us round than our dear friend Iain Russell, archivist of the parish and fellow Partick Thistle supporter, as you will find out. Iain has uncovered a huge amount of information about Glasgow, so he was the man to take us round and show us some of the great sites and some of the great people and some of the great stories about Glasgow's history. We will touch on huge distilleries, we will touch on blending, but we'll also be mentioning riots, the mafia, Sir Walter Scott, and enormous pigs. The weather when we were shooting was, as I think we're entitled to say, somewhat dreich and drubbly. It was cold, it was smirry, there was rain, but it did not let our optimism and joy in revealing part of Glasgow's story to all of you. And now, watch on.
So where are we?
Right, well, at the moment, Dave, we are at probably the highest point in the city of Glasgow in Port Dundas. It was, for a long time, maybe until the 1850s, this was Glasgow's major port. The Forth and Clyde Canal, which links the city to Edinburgh, Grangemouth and the East Coast, was just there. And the Monkland Canal here, which used to bring coal up from the Monkland coal pits, is just down here. The two are connected at Port Dundas. And this was effectively the main industrial centre of Glasgow for decades.
And everything was here, you know, because it was...
All kinds of stuff is here, yeah. So you're talking about flour mills, sugar refineries, all kinds of engineering works, and a huge whisky making industry dominated by the three families, which for right up until the 1900s.
So 4 distilleries?
At its peak, five. But right. Amalgamations, the whole thing, the whole of the everyone knows about the Steens and the Haigs, the dynasties that ran, if you like, that dominated the East Coast whisky industry. Here, it was the McFarlanes, the Harveys, and the Gourleys. They came here in the early 1800s after the opening of the canal, because they'd originally been working out at Paisley, but the canal opened up all the possibilities to bring fuel in to power your steam engines, your stills. You could bring peat, you could export your whisky in the canal, you could take it to the East Coast to go down to London. And this was just a perfect place for the whisky industry. And so the three families built the three main distilleries, which were Port Dundas, Dundas Hill, and at the far end, way past Dundas, Port Dundas, was the Cowley's Distillery, which was owned by the Gourley family.
Yeah.
And it was subsumed by, it was taken over by the Port Dundas Distillery. All these families were all connected, so it's quite difficult to keep track of who was owning who. Quite often they were working together. And also, you also had the fact that the Dundas Hill Distillery was owned by the same people who owned Yoker,
right,
which was another of the big distilleries. But those families were incredibly powerful in Glasgow.
How important Glasgow was in whisky's history, and it's just not talked about.
Dundas Hill Distillery was the biggest malt distillery in Scotland in the 19th century. The biggest malt distillery. Nobody talks about it. The Port Dundas Distillery was the biggest, along with Caledonian in Edinburgh, the biggest distillery in Scotland. Nobody talks about it. Barnard obviously talks about it. But people just go past that in Barnard's.
Wait, it was great.
And move on to the more romantic ones.
It's Glasgow.
These are huge industrial enterprises. We were talking before about behind the distillery over there was a huge dairy, the biggest dairy. It served the whole of Glasgow. 1,000 cows. 1,000 cows is a massive.
Literally straff.
Huge amounts of dry, which were sent up to feed the cows. There was a piggery, as we know, 400 pigs. So you could bacon.
Award-winning pigs.
Pigs. Huge pigs, according to Alfred Barnard. They were the biggest pigs you've ever seen. And so you're supplying Glasgow with not just whiskey, but with bacon and milk. And also with yeast. There was vast amounts of yeast was made, which was supplied to the local bakers. So this big industrial complex, the manure, I call it manure, liquid manure was pumped from the dairy to the farms in Postle over at the back there. So, you know,
Is this like complete
it's an integrated
industrial site?
Yeah.
And it's that, again, it's that idea of scale.
Yeah.
Which is so important. You know, the whiskey by this time, so we're talking, what, 18th century into 19th century into the beginning of 20th century.
It's 19th century here, really. The first one's about 1811.
Yeah.
And in fact, I mean, the original distillery was probably John Haig, who came here because of the canal, and he probably set up the first one. The distillery here, the Dundas Hill one, was originally built by John Haig, but he never really took it anywhere. He died before he could develop it. So there was interest from outside. But the Paisley Mafia, these guys from Paisley, the Harveys, the McFarlanes and the Gourleys, they were the ones that saw the opportunity and moved here. And it's the other thing about it that's really interesting is the families. There was a matriarchy as well as the Elizabeth Harvey is this incredible woman in Paisley who runs a distillery in Gallowhill. She gives evidence to the commission in 1798. She's said to be, she makes the best whiskey in Paisley. All of these guys, you know, it's a whole part of the whiskey industry we don't really talk about.
Yeah.
We also have M. McFarlane and Co, who owned the biggest distillery in Scotland. M. McFarlane was Marion McFarlane, but she didn't put her name Marion McFarlane because it was. But she ran the company after her husband died, for about 25 years.
Yeah. So all of that is just glossed over.
Glossed over, yeah.
Aye. That's right. It's wild. So
So-
the chimney was up.
Yeah, the chimney was up there, but the chimney was, I think, different chimneys went up and came down again. I think the last chimney that came down was about the 1870s.
The mega chimp.
The mega chimney, yeah.
Did it be so big?
It did.
To be so big?
It needed to be so big to almost be called cathedral in terms of, you know, one of the highest man-made structures in Europe. You know, in Glasgow. Yeah. There's no need to have it so big. So all of this
Was Port Dundas Distillery. This part over here, there was other buildings.
on the chimney, famous chimney.
Yes. And the famous dairy farm would be up the hill behind.
I mean, Dundas Hill over here.
Dundas Hill was over here.
Kind of,
And that was owned from the 1820s till the 1830s by a guy called Thomas Harvey, who was famous as Lang Tam, because he was quite tall. So he was called Long Tom Harvey. He had that distillery. He was one of the famous Harveys from Yoker. He had a big business running pubs. They were called Harvey's Divans. They were so called because they were much better than ordinary pubs. You could sit in a divan and recline, having your whiskey. But he went out to Weston. He bought a big house out in Weston, and he built a big wall to stop the locals from going through his estate. And the locals came out one day with guns and explosives, and there was a big fight. The army came. The army came. They had to call the army out to stop. Take the ringleaders to court, and the locals took against him, and they began to boycott his pubs. They boycotted his whiskey, and he ended up going bankrupt, trying to fight a legal case against these guys. And that was when the Dundas Hill Distillery changed hands but it still stayed in the hands of the Harvey family. It was just that Langtam was no more. But again, it's that integrated thing. There was another distillery, a guy called Henry Hoey had a distillery, and he ended up with a chain of licensed grocers or pubs as well. So there's this thing where everything's quite integrated.
So the publicans, distillers, entrepreneurs,
And
farmers.
And once they start to make whiskey like neutral grain spirit, they're supplying, dyes, methylated spirits, there's all kinds of ways in which you can use the spirit that you make, as well as all the byproducts.
Sure.
So
Industrial alcohol.
it's a huge, industrial alcohol, which is a big part of the to this day. With DCL was built on industrial alcohol as
And
well.
kind of the start of urban distilling as well.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. And the McFarlanes, the Gourleys, and the Gourleys and Harveys, here they seem to make that transition from small scale farm distillers. They scale up, and they become basically big industrialists. These distilleries are producing huge quantities of malt whiskey. They're producing huge quantities of pot still grain whiskey. Once the coffee stills go in, they're producing huge quantities of neutral grain spirit. A lot of their stuff's going out as Highland whiskey, Irish whiskey. It's a different time.
Yes.
It's a different time.
Yeah.
And also you'll have not only that, but the Dundas Hill, they have peated malt and unpeated malt.
Yes.
The unpeated malts for the Irish whiskey and the peated malts for the Highland whiskey. So you've got this, they can make anything here.
Yeah.
And they did.
Yes. Yeah. Aye. The famous kind of Irish style that gets mentioned because it's pot still.
That's the thing. So in those days, I think we're kind of hung up on the fact that Scotch whiskey has to come from Scotland, Highland whiskey we think should come from the Highlands, etc. But London gin doesn't come from London. I mean, to them, Highland whiskey was...
They refer to a style.
It was a style. Irish whiskey was a style. Irish people got pissed off about it, clearly, and quite rightly so. But to these guys, it was, that was a style of whiskey. It was triple distilled, usually pot still grain whiskey.
And they were also running malt through the column stills as well.
Yes, there was a steam still.
Right.
There was a steam still in Yoker. I don't know about here.
It's definitely
one in Yoker, and they were using a column still for
malt.
For malt. So everything,
It's everything.
everything under the sun. You just come to Port Dundas and just make it.
Whoa, that wasn't me. That was the bus. Right, we've moved from Port Dundas, from the highest point in the city, which is kind of pretty much the start of modern distilling in Glasgow, down into the city centre. And the city centre is this incredible, like a square mile of what whiskey became in the mid-19th century. So this is where the blenders were. This is where the brokers were as well. And just behind me here, we're on West Nile Street. And in 1855, this is where Robertson and Baxter were founded. And R&B were incredibly important in terms of training blenders. So not only were they blending whiskies to become part of Highland distillers, but they were blending for other companies as well. And other blenders actually received their training here as well. Perhaps William Lowrie did, but certainly the Walkers did as well. So R&B was kind of regarded as being the university of blenders. And from a personal point of view, when I started writing about whiskey, I wanted to find out how a blend was being made. It was in the R&B blending lab that John Ramsay and Alan Reid took me through what blending whiskey was all about. So this is a really important part in whiskey's story because, this is where so many of the great blends were being made and traded and developed. But also it's really important in terms of whiskey, in terms of Glasgow, in terms of, how whiskey evolved. The original building is gone. This is fairly typical of Glasgow. A lot of stuff just gets ripped down and repurposed. Okay. You all right down there?
You have my knee, you gotta be wet.
I don't think you're going to get up, to be perfectly honest, to save your pain. And the reason we're here is because of this, which is really maybe the last manifestation of the glory days.
So William Teacher, young guy, he worked in his girlfriend's shop in Anderston, and he noticed, of course, that there was an interest in whiskey. He began to open dram shops, a bit like Harvey's divan shops, maybe not quite as posh. But the difference with the Teacher's shops, the Teacher's whiskey shops, which he started, the first one was in Anderston. He ended up with, I think, 20 shops in the end. The difference was that they were very, very well controlled, if you like. There was no smoking. You couldn't buy rounds. The barman was under strict instructions that anyone who drunk too much had to be invited to leave. And those shops were incredibly successful. And Teacher, the family who came after, eventually began to blend their own whiskies, not just to sell it in their own pubs. They blended their own whiskey, and in the end, they built a distillery, Ardmore, and they bought Glendronach. The company became a huge company, exported all around the world, big in Australia. Strangely, a bit like William Whiteley's, they were quite keen on this round the world thing where they would mature their whiskey on ships, ocean-going ships, and they would take them off on a voyage. And apparently, they claimed that this would blend the whiskey. The whiskey would marry better in the cask. By the 1970s, 80s, Teacher's is probably the second biggest whiskey brand in the UK. Still huge in other markets as well. Famous for one particular advertising campaign, which was introduced by John Struthers, the marketing, the advertising agency, which was responsible in particular for the Glasgow Smells Better campaign. Teacher's was always associated very, very strongly with Glasgow. And then it was eventually taken over by Allied. And now it's not quite what it was. It doesn't have the same focus as it used to have.
It's a shame.
It's a shame, yeah. This was probably abandoned about the 1980s.
Yeah, I remember. Sorry.
The plans for the building were to have flats in the top and to have a Teacher's restaurant, tasting room cum shop on the ground floor. But since COVID, nothing's happened.
It's flown away. Okay, so still in St Enoch Square here, but behind us here was St Enoch Station, which was a beautiful, beautiful station. But underneath were massive cellars, including the cellars of Greenlees brothers. And Greenlees were a very, very significant player in blended whiskey. And thanks to Alia from Diageo Archive, got this account of visit of the Chinese ambassador to Greenlees cellar in 1900. And he was very impressed, as ambassadors often are. And there was 2 million gallons being stored in the cellars here. And the ambassador says, in China, all the best poets could only be got to write their best poetics by spirit. Here he mentioned a word in Chinese, evidently meaning the native equivalent to alcohol, adding he didn't mean the spirit which is manufactured here. He felt most thankful to their poets in writing a good poetries to amuse or delight them. He had therefore to thank Messrs. Greenlees for manufacturing a thing which would move those highly gifted poets to write their best poetries for them. China was now to be open to the trade of the West, and he only hoped that by taking whiskey, they would be enabled to replace other vices, laughter, such as opium smoking. He thought that spirit always made people jolly, while opium made them sleepy. So the opening of the Chinese market starts here underneath what used to be Glasgow's most beautiful station.
We're standing on Wellington Street, and once upon a time, a lot of whisky offices in this street, for example, White and Mackay was just along the road. That building's gone now. But behind me here, you've got the offices of Wright Grieg, which was founded in 1878. Big company in Glasgow, originally in Cadogan Street, moved to these purpose-built buildings. I think they had behind here, you've got your warehouses and so on. Beautiful, beautiful frontage. You can see, basically, it sums up just how wealthy these blenders had become. On the front, you've got depictions of Highlanders. These people are probably depictions from the story of Roderick Dhu. The Wright Grieg's most famous blend was Roderick Dhu, from the stories of Sir Walter Scott, and these are characters from the novel. And here's a bus. And there's a bottle. But I mean, look at all that detail up there. That's just absolutely amazing. And that'll be the director's room at the top. So, Wright and Grieg, their most famous blend was called Roderick Dhu. It was a hugely popular blend. But they also, Wright and Grieg also did a very, very well-known Irish brand called Shogren. And was one of many Scotch companies which did blends of what they described as Irish whiskey, which was in the Irish style. The pub, the building itself became part of Bullock and Wade, and then eventually fell to Diageo. I think Diageo's engineering headquarters were here for many years, but the building's been empty for quite a long while. Its future seems to be up in the air, I think. But certainly the name of the blend, the Roderick Dhu, is commemorated in a pub along the street here, which is called the Roderick Dhu. Okay, so we're standing in front of William Whiteley's warehouse. William Whiteley was a Yorkshireman who came up to Scotland to work in Leith in the whisky industry in the early 1900s. It's a long story, a checkered history, working for Monroe's. He went bankrupt for a while. When he came back, he bought a company called J.G. Turney, which became his kind of front, if you like, for a vast number of whisky companies which he accumulated. Most important of all was William Whiteley & Co. William Whiteley's famous brands were King's Ransom and House of Lords. At some point in the 1920s, probably, he began to make a lot of trips to Canada, and he sold a lot of King's Ransom in Canada. He had an agent in Canada. He also had a friend of the agent called Broom, who, through various contacts, put him in touch indirectly with Lucky Luciano. Everything's a bit indirect. Mr. Broom subsequently got put in a concrete waistcoat because he stole some whiskey from a guy called Costello, Frank Costello, who was Lucky Luciano's friend. So he disappeared from the scene. But William Whiteley continued to supply Lucky Luciano and his network, if you like, with King's Ransom. King's Ransom, for example, Oni Madden, who owned the Cotton Club, he was one of their big customers. He used to transport it about in laundry trucks. Because it was still illegal during Prohibition, obviously. Around about 1938, 39, Whiteley was getting quite old, and the Frank Costello and some of his associates decided they would like to buy the company. So a guy called Irving Heim, who I've told Dave here, is I think the only Romanian-born Jewish American who ever owned a Scotch whisky company. Irving Heim became the frontman, or technically the owner of William Whiteley & Co., supplying King's Ransom, House of Lords and other brands to the Americas. Frank Costello was their, quote, sales representative. He used to go to places and persuade them to buy King's Ransom, and he was paid a huge amount of money to do so. And why not? And why not? So Whiteley's was here until the 1970s, I think. Irving Heim used to come here regularly right up until his death in 1978. Apparently a really nice man. People liked him. The scale is huge. I mean, they bought this from, I can't remember the name of the company, but what you have to remember is this is now down by the river. At this point, Glasgow is now the main, it's the main export city for anything going west. Their business was mostly with the Americans. So basically, you just have to take the whiskey down the road there, load it onto a ship, off it goes to the US. So you can see the shift from the whiskey industry shifting down from the Forth and Clyde Canal in the north of the city down towards the river. As the river gets deepened and international trade, with it, especially with America, gets developed. And subsequently, and now I think William Whiteley's is owned by Pernod Ricard.
It is,
So everything, but long gone, and all their brands have now gone as well.
Here we are. So this is one of the entrances to the old James Buchanan offices in Washington Street, which is where my uncle used to work. And had all the horses, the Clydesdale horses were stabled round the corner. So I used to come down here of a weekend to see the horses. And I mean, it's virtually untouched, this part. The other end of the warehousing was all been redeveloped into very modern offices, but you can still see some of the vestiges of the old days looking through here. But this was at one time the biggest bonded warehouse in the world. It was established originally by W.P. Lowrie, William Falk Lowrie, who began as a blender 1869 in Hope Street and then moved down here. Incredibly important man in the history of Scotch whisky. And he essentially bankrolled James Buchanan of Black and White at one point. And then when Lowrie died, Buchanan essentially took over that end of the business. Lowrie was also the agent for Gonzalez Baez sherry. So he was getting all the sherry casks in from Spain, and had a cooperage in Hyde Park Street, which is kind of just the other side of what is now the Kingston Bridge. And it's there where he patented his wine seasoning of whiskey casks, because the sherry trade was beginning to go into decline at the tail end of the 19th century, just as the Scotch whisky industry was beginning to take off. So there's increased demand for sherry casks, but less availability of sherry casks. So what Lowrie did was find a way to actually season new wood, importing staves of wood, building new casks in Hyde Park Street, and then seasoning them with, sherry. Which is kind of what Diageo still do in an adapted way in their bodega system up in Carsbridge. It's continuing what was established by Lowrie. But this warehouse was absolutely enormous. When James Buchanan opened the extension of it in 1907, the scale was absolutely extraordinary. It said that 8 weeks' supply would, if you put all the bottles end to end, it would stretch 53 miles. If you put all the cases stacked one on top of each other, they would be higher than Mount Everest itself. There was this extraordinary banquet that was held when it was the warehouse, this new warehousing was opened in 1907, and all the guests were served not whiskey, but 4 different types of champagne, including Charles Isaac, which was Lowrie's, as well as Gonzalez Baez sherries, but not a drop of whiskey was consumed that night. And so, somewhat bedraggled and drookit, we made our way to Clydeside Distillery, which is reviving distilling in the city centre, as well as paying tribute to Glasgow's whisky history. It was a wonderful, warm refuge for us both. This is a perfect way to end.
It is indeed, sure, yes.
So, A, because it's not raining,
Yes.
and B, because here we are looking out over the mighty River Clyde.
Exactly.
Yeah. In a brand new distillery as well, which is
The return of distilling to Glasgow.
which is important, because a lot of it has been about how distilleries closed down and an element of devastation and buildings which have been emptied and etc. So it looks pessimistic, but here we are. And what I find fascinating about here is Clydeside is this amalgamation of an old building, the old pump house, with a brand new distillery. What could you go?
Yeah. And the fact that the distillery has been built on the site of the dock from which Glasgow was exporting all its whisky to America, to Ireland, to various countries, makes it all the more kind of.
There's a resonance to the old thing.
And I think there's also the fact that the dock was filled in with the rubble from St Gino Station, which was where the whisky used to mature. So, it's kind of building on the foundations of the past, literally.
Yeah. Yeah, so an optimistic end to a tour around Glasgow. That where do you think it's going? In general, what do you think are people more aware of Glasgow's whiskey history, or
I don't think people. There's a generation that's gone since the industry kind of left, and people have kind of forgotten just how important whiskey was to Glasgow. And it's never going to be the same as it was. No one's going to start building mega distilleries like they built at Port Dundas. But there is room for smaller distilleries like this one, catering for not for a local demand, but catering for a connoisseur market, if you like. And it's great. I mean, hopefully there's more to come.
because I mean, what you saw was that that all of those firms in the middle of town, a lot of them then they moved out. They kind of moved out to the outskirts. So Buchanan went out to Steps. R&B in Highland moved out along Great Western Road. So everybody kind of left the city centre. I mean, why do you think all of those offices kind of disappeared?
I mean, there's various reasons for that. And one of them, bizarrely, it would be that in the industrial city, it became too crowded. Transport, traffic, etc. became a problem. And as the city has kind of deindustrialised, there's more room for distilleries to move back in. I think a lot of people left because rates went up. Transport was a problem within the city. And that's no longer such a big issue. And there's more tourists now coming to the city centre.
Sure.
So and tourism is a big thing, because that's a way people who come. We can see it in Edinburgh with Johnny Walker. That they have a big exhibition, if you like, right in the centre of Edinburgh. Not for the people of Edinburgh, it's for the tourists. People who are from abroad, they can come to Edinburgh and they can see what Johnny Walker's got to offer. And that could be the future for a lot of brands, I think, in Glasgow as well.
And I think what I really love about what they've done here is the way that they're telling the story of whiskey in Glasgow. I mean, they're not just saying, well, we're only going to talk about our brand. They're actually sort of expanding all that information and all that story to include all of Lang Tam and Teacher and Buchanan, etc.
And the fact that it's a Glasgow company going back. The people who own Clydeside have got a history in the industry, and it's on the West Coast as well as other parts of the Imperial.
It's Morrison's once again kind of coming back in. But I mean, it's not to say that there aren't whiskey firms within Glasgow themselves. White Mackay are still based here. Edgington still is and Douglas Line. They're still here.
Oh yeah, there still is a presence. Yeah, but there's not manufacturing presence.
Apart from Strathclyde.
Apart from Strathclyde, which is often forgotten about. Almost by us. But it's not as if it's something that you can actually miss, because it's a huge production plant. Yeah, and it's a very important production plant, so we must remember Strathclyde. But because it's not a brand as such, no one's going to visit. Strathclyde's not a place you go to visit. It's an important part of Shivers.
Yeah. So Glasgow Whisky City once more?
I think so. It's about time that the name of Glasgow was restored
to its rightful place,
to the Whiskey Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't that's history for you, though, isn't it? Everything kind of goes in huge cycles and this huge circle.
But to a certain extent, it happened to Edinburgh, and Edinburgh's kind of revived partly through Johnny Walker, and but again partly because of the tourist industry, because people went to Edinburgh. So the whiskey companies suddenly realised, well, we should actually be here and invest in money in Scotland as well as in Changi Airport or that kind of thing.
Well, it's been a treat, man. It's been a treat.
Yeah, exactly.
Pleasure. Your stairs. On the jigs. And so, in the warmth of a distillery, we bid farewell to Glasgow for the time being, because this was merely scratching at the surface, giving all of us an introduction to how important the city was in the birth and the growth of Scotch whisky. There are so many more rabbit holes to explore, so many stories, so many people, so many brands to start digging into, which is what we love to do the best. So think of this as just that introduction. We will be returning to Glasgow to explore more and more over the next few months. But we can only do this thanks to your support. So as ever, thank you, patrons, for putting your hands in your digital pockets to help us explore and investigate and fossick around in whisky's history. And thanks also to all who saved us on the way, to all the bus drivers who didn't splash too close to the pavement to soak us, to publicans for pouring pints, and most of all, to Arthur Motley for getting his knees wet and actually keeping us on track. Never an easy thing. Thanks again, folks, and we'll see you soon.